Hi, Julie Asher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I'm back with another 3D Christmas cookie project. And in this video, we're making 3D Christmas cookie boxes. I've made a number of other boxes in some of my other videos. They've all been kind of angular or rectangular. This one's unique insofar as we're going to be using contoured cookie sides, as I describe in my contoured cookie video. Now, I'm going to be handling this project in two parts. First, we'll talk about making the bottom, and then in part two, we'll talk about making the lid. And I broke it up purposely because it's a rather involved project, but also because the bottom in and of itself makes a great cookie gift at Christmas time or holiday time. Without the lid, as you see up here, it can be just filled with a piece of napkin or liner and then stuffed with cookies, and it makes a great hostess gift or something to bring to a cookie swap. So you don't necessarily need to make the lid. Of course, if you want to go over the top, as I often do, then the lid is a necessity, and we'll get to that in part two. And what you'll need for this project are basically three cookie components, which you see here in front of me. I've got a ring here, a disc, a round, and that was cut with a 7-inch round cutter. You can do these in any size, by the way. I chose this particular size because the shaping of the sides is very easily done over the sides of a 6-inch cake pan. The other two pieces you'll need are two contoured sides, as you see here. And just briefly, let me talk about how I got those sides. I do have a whole video on contouring cookie dough. And in my last video about the snow globes, you saw me contouring the dough in yet another way. And to create these sides, I basically cut a strip about 9 inches long and about 1 3/4 inches wide and lay it on the side of a 6-inch cake pan. Prop it in something. In this case, I'm using a cookie cutter. Put it on a cookie sheet and bake it in a 375-degree oven for about 10 minutes. Let it cool slightly. While it's still warm, pop it off the cake pan and then reshape it to make sure it's perfectly circular, and then let it dry, let it cool completely. There are many different ways you could decorate the sides of these things. It's a very versatile project. We are going to be using wafer paper and appliqué work on this because it's rather straightforward, but I just want to show you an example here of another way you can possibly decorate. This particular side was first iced. It was first dipped in royal icing, which is really tricky on a piece this big. I have a whole another video on dipping. You can see how I do that, but it's a little harder on a piece this big. I then laid a frosting sheet on it and then sprayed with an edible luster spray to create the stenciled effect, and then laid appliqué down. But because the dipping and the stenciling are a little more challenging, and again, I do have videos on those, I thought I'd stick with a simple papering technique. So we are going to be laying edible papers, frosting sheets in particular, a two-tone effect on the sides of these baskets. In my previous Easter basket video, I show how to put a single strip down. Here we're taking it up a notch by doing a double layer with some cutouts. I always like to work on cardboard because it's easy to disrupt these pieces, and this piece is a little bit soft actually, so I'm going to handle it carefully. Frosting sheets are an edible paper. It's really generally pretty full-bodied as compared to a wafer paper, so you can't see through it. And that's the beauty of using it on something like gingerbread. If you were to put wafer paper up against the sides of these, you'd most certainly see through it. And I've got two types of frosting sheets here, a green piece that I've cut to about 1.5 inches tall, and it's just long enough to go around. You might wonder why I bake in halves. It's because I can't really bake a fully rounded piece without the bottom really misshaping. So I do have to bake in halves and piece it together. And it also just so happens that the wafer paper sheets, which are about 8 by 10, are just long enough to get around. So I will have a seam on the sides, but if I'm careful about how I lay this frosting sheet, I should be able to conceal those seams pretty well. I've pre-cut these. For the green piece, I like to use my paper cutter to get it super straight. This cutout piece was done with a white frosting sheet and a craft paper punch, and I showed in my previous video about snow globes how I use this particular Martha Stewart punch. It's really fun for making long ribbon-like strips. And I'll have links in the video description to all these tools. Now my first step is to put the white on top of the green. I want to make sure that I have a fairly good fit at the seam. You know, if I were really thoughtful about this, in terms of piecing it together, I'd make sure that the diamond, see how it's split in half here, is also split in half here, so it matches up perfectly when it hits the seam. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that here though, because I just have enough length to go around this other half. with cookie baking, things aren't always perfectly symmetric. Oh, and one other thing I should note is that you want to make sure that the sides of your box fit nicely together. And often when they come off the sheet tray baked, they'll be a little bit rounded or misformed at the end. So you just want to trim them up so they're straight and fit flush against the other piece. I use a paring knife and I gradually shave like so they're straight. Depending on how soft or hard the gingerbread is, you'll either shave or you'll cut right through, but you just want to be careful with it because it is easy to snap. So I've already pre-shaved these pieces I'm working with. So again, there's a back side to a frosting sheet and a front side, or at least different effects. One side's shinier than the other. And typically I like to have the shiny side down, though I don't think it really matters. So to stick this down, I'm just applying a little bit of corn syrup as glue. I prefer this to royal icing just because it's a little less lumpy and therefore less likely to cause any kind of ripple when I put the, between the frosting sheets when I put them together. So just enough to make it tacky. And again, I like to put this on the green, lying flat rather than putting the green up on the cookie and then putting the white up, because it's just easier to get the white straighter on this piece if you do it this way. I'm working on a little bit of parchment paper so that I don't get my underlying surface too messed up. I think I have this situated about, you don't want it to drop too soon. I'd like to hover it over the green and just about center it before I let it drop, because it's otherwise difficult to lift it once it's down. Just gently pat it into place. I've now got to put a little bit of corn syrup on this back side so I can get it up on this other half. But I don't always like to turn it directly over onto the piece of parchment I just used because there's corn syrup on it, and that might leave a spot on top of the frosting sheet. So I like to get a clean piece of parchment paper before I do that. And now I'm going to be applying, same process, corn syrup here, and we'll be sticking it up onto the cookie at this point. Now I cut this a little shy of the height of the cookie. The height of the cookie is 1.75 inches. I don't need this as wet as I've got it, so I might want to blot it a little bit off. A sponge brush also works great for this because it tends to distribute a little more evenly than a brush. So that tool is also quite handy here. Anyway, back to why I cut this a little bit shy of the 1.75 inches. The strip is only 1.5 inches tall. It's because I like to leave a little edge for border, but also because the cookie can tend to slope in at the top, so the frosting sheet doesn't always adhere to that top edge so well. And when it doesn't adhere to the top edge, it makes getting a border down there with icing a little bit more difficult later. I'm just gonna take off a little bit of the extra. Just be careful. Okay, and then I want to make sure I think this is just long enough to go around. So it's a little bit longer than the piece, which is great because I think I'm going to start it halfway through the diamond so that it matches up with the other half well. Remember, the other half cut off halfway through the diamond. Yeah, I've just got enough to do that well. Get that out of the way, and then we just want to clean our hands so you don't get any corn syrup on the outer face, and just make sure everything is nicely stuck down. Often at the ends it likes to lift, so I'll apply a little more corn syrup there. And if there's not a lot of excess, I'll fold it around so that I don't have any gingerbread showing at the seam. But in this case, I've got a fair bit of extra, so I am going to trim a little bit here. And smaller scissors can also be useful. These are a little clunky for this. Okay, so we've got that down. What I'm ready to do at this stage is actually assemble it with the other piece, and then we'll put the details on the outer edge. I apply additional appliqué. I'm just replicating actually this bottom here, I've got additional applique and beadwork on it, and it's easier for me to put that on when the whole piece is together so I can make sure that everything is uniformly spaced. I've got my finished box in front of me, the one I'm aiming toward, and I just want to show you my treatment of the seam here. I spent a lot of time trying to match up the frosting sheets here, and then I concealed the seam with a little red applique. And in the ideal world, that's how you'd want to handle the seam. Just really think about it thoughtfully so you can cover it up. You can also consider a horizontal, or rather a vertical pattern, where you're piping vertically up the sides of the boxes, because that's an easy way to hide a vertical seam. Another trick to hiding seams is one that I used up on the cookie box up there. This cookie box actually has a lid, which you'll see in part 2, that has a lot of cookie poinsettia on top. And so I just used some elements of the poinsettia, some of the petals down here to conceal the seam, glued on those cookies there. So different tactics. Today we might not be as precise because I just want to give you the general gist of how to put this together. Okay, so I've got my two sides together now, covered with frosting sheets. And the key thing I want to do here is just make sure they're nicely centered on the round that they're going down on, and they're joining as nicely as they can. And then I'm just going to glue them together. Typically I choose a front at this point too. If there's a longer piece than the other, then that's the one I like to face forward because the seam's less likely to show from the front. So I think this will be my front. So I've got a thick brown royal icing glue, and I'm just applying it very generously to the inside. So you will see this glue. I've matched it though to the color of the gingerbread, so you're less likely to see it. Some will show, which is why I always line these boxes with a little bit of paper before putting anything in them. You could be a little more fussy than that, maybe pipe a fancy border in there, but I figure people are going to be looking more at the outsides than they are the insides. The one thing I do like to do is take a clean finger and just kind of smooth down the seam so there's less interfering, there's less on the inside of the box. Here's the unsmooth seam, here's the smooth seam at the top. So I'm just going to, you could use a fondant balling tool to get in there as well and do that to smooth it out if you didn't want to get your hands involved. And the other area I like to seam is up the vertical seam here on these two sides. Again, with a little bit of brown icing. This should be enough to keep the box together. Of course, this can't bear weight on its own without a support from underneath. So once it's dry, I always put it on another decorative plate before I fill it, or leave it on a cardboard. These cardboards I've got them on now are just for working purposes. I would put them on a prettier plate for presentation, but always remember to support from underneath. Even though you are gluing it, it's not a real cookie box. It's not a real box, I should say. It's certainly a real cookie box. And I'm just pressing these two edges together. My dough is a little bit soft. If I were to prop that there, I might be able to keep that edge from popping out. It's popping out a little bit from the other one. You could give this a little bit of drying time, but it's not a necessity as long as you're careful. I'm going to elevate this, and I'm going to start first by applying those red fondant transfers that I have in the middle of each diamond. I should say red royal icing transfers, excuse me, they're not fondant. They're made with royal icing, and I've got a whole video on that process. To put these in place, I am going to switch to a white royal icing glue, just because if I make a mistake, it's much easier to clean white off of anything than it is the brown that I was working with on the interior of the box. And I used the brown on the interior of the box just so it was less likely to show. This is a pretty simple design. I'm just going to plant one on the center of each diamond and go all the way around. One reason it's nice to have a little drying time on this is so that the box sides don't move, because I am gently pressing into the side to get those transfers up. So one thing you'll notice that I'm doing here is just holding the box as I press into it so that the box doesn't shift. That wouldn't be so necessary if the royal icing had had time to dry. So you might want to give it an hour before you continue decorating. I've got the royal icing applique on there all the way around, and you can look how pretty that looks. We're just going to finish it rather simply because my lid is going to be pretty ornate. Actually, with this project, I usually start with the lid if I'm going to do the lid, get it all designed out, and then design the base to kind of work with it and not compete with it. So I know that the lid that I'm going to do in the next step is going to be pretty busy, so we're just going to do simple shell border here. Whenever you're working with royal icing with a metal tip where you want the icing to hold its texture, here I've got a star tip, it's number 27. You want to make sure the icing is very, very thick, otherwise it won't hold its shape. So this is very close to my glue consistency. And I'm going to start at my seam here because that's an ugly spot anyway, and it's nice to start and end in your worst possible spot, because if you've got a worst possible spot, you can conceal it later, maybe with another ornament. I periodically stop and clean my tip if I've got a lot of extra, but basically I'm pushing forward, pulling back, releasing pressure, applying pressure, pulling back, and that's the general motion. So one more time. Apply pressure to create the bead, pull back. Apply pressure to create the bead, pull back, and let them overlap. I'm back, I've got the star border down, and I've even done some dot work along the edge. Before I finish off the dot work, I wanted to pause briefly and talk about gingerbread. I had mentioned earlier that mine was a little soft, and I am actually working with it. It's softer than the ideal consistency for this project today. It really shouldn't be bending like this. It's best when you bake your gingerbread, cool it down completely, then put it in an airtight container until you're ready to assemble it, and don't expose it to any humidity. We had a really bad run of humidity over the last couple of weeks, and I had these out and unboxed, and they got kind of soft. And that just makes the assembly process more difficult, and they'll also be less sturdy when you put the lid on top. So it's best to work with a really rigid gingerbread. If it does get soft, you can re-dry it. Just drape it back over that 6-inch cake pan, put it back in the oven and rebake it and recool it. That'll harden it back up. You know, alternatively, once it's cool, you can also paint a very thin layer of royal icing on the inside, and that royal icing will act as a barrier and keep it more rigid as well. You know, coat the entire inside, top to bottom, before you assemble it. So that's another trick. But I just wanted to point that out because I wanted you to know that that wasn't exactly the ideal conditions. Now I've got icing of beadwork consistency, and again, you could finish the edge out in any which way, but these dots look kind of pretty, and they kind of parallel some of the dots that I've got in the frosting sheet cutouts. Beadwork consistency, those consistency adjustments are on my website and a link in the video description, but basically you're looking for relatively loose icing that forms a nice rounded dot on its own, and I try to pipe as perpendicularly to the surface as possible so I get a nice rounded shape. I'm just going to come to a close here at the seam, and then I'm going to elevate this and do dots around the upper edge to finish off the upper edge of the green frosting sheet. So that's what the bottom looks like. Now I am elevating it just because I need it at eye level. It's just easier for me to pipe on the sides of things when it's closer to eye level. I've got a little non-skid shelf liner here just so I don't accidentally push this off the top of this slippery surface. Same process with dots up here. Perpendicular, as perpendicular to the surface as possible. Same icing. Okay, dots are all done. I still have a little bit of a gap between the white dots and the upper edge, which I could fill with another row of dots or another 2 rows of dots, but I think that I'm going to leave it simple like this. The reality is if you do put a lid on it, you're not going to see that upper edge of gingerbread anyway because the lid's going to cover it. The other thing I want to point out is you do want to leave the very, very uppermost edge clear of any icing decoration. As much as you might feel compelled to cover it if it's uneven, it will interfere with the closing of the lid or placing the lid on top. Of course, you could finish it off if you're just doing a standalone base, if you'd want, and filling it with cookies without a lid. So that's the base. We'll move on to part 2, which is talking about how to make the lid. Till then, live sweetly.